Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Larson, and I'm here with Ingrid Song. Ingrid, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, hi. I'm Ingrid. It's so great to meet you, Rina. I am a senior here at Williams. I'm studying art history, and I am from New Jersey. Emma?
Yeah,
Nice.
I'm also a senior. I'm actually studying Russian and history here, but both Ingrid and I are interns at WICMA and are also part of the Agents for Creative Action project. And one of our ongoing year-long endeavors has been interviewing artists, and we have this lovely opportunity to talk to Rina Banerjee, which is just so incredible. I'm so looking forward to asking some really stimulating questions that I have when looking at your work that I think can really help us contextualize the role of art in this very strange time. So for a quick introduction for people not as familiar with Rina, she was born in Kolkata, India, and spent most of her childhood in London. Later on in her life, Rina moved to the US, where she completed a BF in engineering and then got an MFA in painting and printmaking from the Yale School of Art in 1995. Rina's work has been shown at many notable museums, both in the US and abroad, and it brings together a really beautiful myriad of methods, mediums, and media. She prints on paper, paints on wood panels, makes sculptures out of plastic and umbrellas and feathers and all different kinds of things. I think the multiplicity of Rina's practice is really intentional. I think that we'll get to ask this, but it, to me, comments on the range of our own human experience and forces us to ask what makes us sane, what makes us different, and what power dynamics go into our answers to those questions. Yeah, so really looking forward to this conversation. And I think Ingrid has a question to start us off.
Yeah, so the first question that I have to ask you, Rina, is I'm really interested in how your work comments on the relationship between personal history and cultural history, and also on migration and human movement. And so, yeah, I wanted to ask you what interests you about migration and why is it such a core theme to so much of your artwork?
So I think the most interesting thing that has happened in my 20 years of making art as a professional artist, which, I kind of count during grad school when I was doing my MFA at Yale and continue to the present time, is that we are allowed to do and make our work any way we want to. That means cross disciplines. It means anything, any subject matter that moves you to make art is legit. So in the 90s and 80s, that wasn't really true. And there was a lot of conversation about what qualifies as the right ambition for making art and becoming an artist. And so during my time, the word immigrant was never used in the context of art. It was either foreign art or, New York art or American art or by some continent. And secondly, there was no perception or delivery of the idea that contemporary art existed outside of Western society. That did not even exist. So for someone who is South Asian or non-white or female to come into this scene and talk about their work often meant that your faculty, your culture here in the United States would usher you to reference Matisse or Picasso as your ambition and to quote their lives as if you identified with it. So self-identifying and re-identifying and claiming new identities was very much the project of my generation. And it happened not as a kind of leap of faith, but rather that when I went to a critique at my graduate school, people would say, so you're a foreigner and you know nothing about American culture because you're Indian. So what are you going to tell us about Indian art?
Mhm.
So for me, it was really important to legitimize the location of my work as diaspora and to create a whole area of thinking that allowed so many people who are not included in this history to speak. So it was very confusing for some the audience that we understood was the audience then and dominantly still is, to surrender their thoughts to your ideas as someone who is not part of the mainstream. So to stroke that water and to bring mixing to happen meant talking about that interface. So I had to mix, going back to your question, these ideas of the personal, because we all have a personal. This is where we all come together as human beings. We're all human. So we have all a personal history. We may or may not have a family that we belong to, but we can talk about this idea, this global idea of family. And so being an immigrant was a very dangerous thing to call your work. What does that mean? Where's the history? I mean, did Matisse talk about it? No, in fact, it was the reverse. An artist would go into the world and discover exotic places and saturate themselves with that culture and become more foreign than the provincial place they were from. And that created art. And that defined what the representation and the legendary artist would be, this exotic thing. Mm-hmm. So the personal was very important to ground that, hey, we're not that exotic. We have mothers, we have fathers, we have brothers and sisters. We cook in the afternoon and we clean and we do laundry. So unlike Andy Warhol, maybe, talking about the domestic was not only just feminist, but it created a place to demystify the exotic. So that's why the personal and the immigrant and the diaspora is so important to understanding feminism and also creating this larger enclave where, you know, all these issues of difference come together to play.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful answer. And I think really connected to what WICMA sees in your work. I know that you're in our upcoming Sweaty Concepts exhibition, where we have one of your pieces, which is so exciting. It's called Dangerous World. And Sweaty Concepts, the title draws inspiration from Sarah Ahmed's labeling of concepts, which come out of a description of a body which is not at home in this world. And I think that that sentiment speaks really beautifully to what you're saying is the role of art and kind of taking different pieces of things to make a whole that is both individualized and communal. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work Dangerous World and how you see it interacting with the themes of Sweaty Concepts. And I'd also just be really interested to hear the process, the artistic process and the thought process behind the work.
So the work in question, Dangerous World, was really made at a time when I realized that the world was full of the unknown. And mm-hmm. So the imagery that you see, if I can describe the painting to you in the way that I see it, is all these little creatures, nebulous, a constellation of things loom over you. They're both the material world, the invisible world, the future, the past. And centered in that are three figures. They're the figures of my partner, myself, and my daughter. And we are a family. And we're standing on this red, beautiful, lush thing that I conceive of as a lava, another kind of place that is about to move as the ground moves with lava. And so the danger surrounding yourself came out of my personal experience of that year, which was a year where I was getting treatment for cancer, actually. And also, my daughter was coming into her own and becoming part of the public world. She had, as someone who was a little older in middle school, she could go to the corner store by herself while I counted the seconds that she was gone. And so the worry over her future, the worry for myself, my family, all these were really wrapped together. And it was a time where in 2008, we were going through some economic upheavals in the United States, and the EU was coming together as a force to be reckoned. And so there was a lot of mergers. There was new art in the scene, Chinese art, African art, all these things were happening. And it created a kind of moment of both crisis, adventure, and just joy. So one of the things I take away with this work is the world with all its crisis and danger is a world that is both unknown and exciting. And you can't even mark time unless you have that excitement. And to mark time means to create a place in the future for yourself. So I was very much engrossed in the idea of how time stops when you're in crisis, but it also is a place of transformation. And I think for at least right now, very, very true to the times that we're going through at the moment, we are in that crisis that we also understand that is also a moment of joy that we will transform and grow to be something even more important to us.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful sentiment, a really beautiful way to think about this past year. And you just talked about a year in your life that was full of crisis and full of hardship. And so I'm curious as to how the pandemic and this past year has impacted your artistic practice.
You know, coincidentally, my work from its very beginning really spoke of disease. And it talked about the problem of disease as a way to understand, one, migration, but also understand our colonial history. That the movement of people from place to place, whether it is settlers coming to America and disease affecting, you know, the indigenous people or Native Americans or immigrants in Ellis Island being checked for disease. It is a place where it invites new kinds of information about our bodies. And so that is then framed as disease, because when are we the most likely to think about our health, our bodies? It's a time when bodies are dropping, literally. And so it forces us to understand that being educated about our bodies is also realizing how human we are. And that is the very important takeaway, I think, about disease, that we are all human. And even animals, as we speak of COVID, is very much related to us, impact us. And in this time of connectivity and connections, we understand that disease is only one way to realize that all of it is connected, that everything on the earth in all its variety and difference has a kind of link or commonality that we can think about, which is its sameness, that we're all sprouted from a single place. Mm-hmm. And I think with global warming, that's become really relevant to understand conceptually as a community, as a human community, that this is our home, and our home is not just New York City. And maybe in the future, when we introduce an artist, we won't even say you're born here, you live here, you work here, and your childhood is here, because we'll have been so connected and identified with the larger space that will not need to say that. to frankly, to say that means that we are still wedded to this idea of separation and distance in order to make meaning. And that's not the only way to make meaning.
Yeah, yeah, I think the talk of bodies is really interesting, and how vulnerable and like scary and human bodies are. And I think the pandemic really does draw that out. It makes me think of like your large installation pieces, because I think that we interact with those in a very bodily way compared to like looking at a painting. A lot of your pieces have been described as immersive and multi-sensory. Can you talk a little bit more about why that as an art form is attractive to you, and what you think that can bring out beyond just a painting on a wall?
Well, the sculpture, if you're referring to the sculpture and installation, it's in some ways is concrete. It is physical in the way we conceptualize in our own language, sculpture versus painting. And it creates an environment in some cases, especially with larger installation and the scaling up of things. And I think that, you know, some of the sculptures that are smaller are probably the size of a piece of furniture in your room. You know, it's something you're familiar with in terms of scale. So it has a relevant intimacy associated with it. I'm very interested in intimacy. And intimacy is the most personal thing you can say about any relationship. It is the conveyor of all these ideas about vulnerability, fragility, sharing, desiring, and a kind of hopefulness is there in intimacy, I think. And I think the work that is installation or sculpture in some way has elements or ingredients of its own making that we can identify as not only part of the sculpture, but about a different history. For example, a light bulb that may appear in a sculpture is both part of the sculpture, it is the sculpture. And at the same time, we do this mind thing where we understand this is a light bulb. I know what a light bulb is. I have one at home, you know? So this identification that you have out of familiarity creates a level of intimacy that is so comfortable that people can slide into it, all right? And then on the other hand, there are things that may be more unfamiliar, that we could even say are exotic. They could be souvenirs that are exotic, that recall other places that are far away, remote. And they create a kind of different way we identify that allows us to travel, to be transformed by our travel, to escape where we are, to be freer in that place that is far away. And so it allows us to be something we're not in the place that we call home. So all these things that create distance and proximity in different levels can be appreciated through the sculpture as something that inserts a level of intimacy for both things close by and those things far away. And this is really important for my work because I'm talking about not only South Asian culture or American culture or Northeast culture or New York culture, but I'm talking about all culture. Can we identify with all culture? And my position is, of course we can. We made that culture. And no other time better than to talk about how much we miss and need this kind of culture that we represent through art than now, when we feel alienated and lacking in the social discourse that we require to feel intimacy and connection that marks our whole life. So I think those are the most important things I really kind of feel I achieve in not only making the work and choosing what goes into the work, but also in sharing what I choose. both the audience and I are probably familiar with these things, but at the same time, it's this kind of choosing, the juxtaposition, the arrangement that I choose makes it unique and makes it my work.
Do you mind talking a little bit more about how you choose and how you decide which objects go into a particular work, because you have such a wide range of materials that have all sorts of different cultural significance attached to them. And so I'm curious as to sort of what goes through your head when you're sort of pulling all these pieces together.
So I think it's just an evolution that came out of my own roaming around in an urban place, you know, as a child and as an artist now. I think browsing, the physical experience of browsing, as well as maybe the digital experience of browsing, are things that we desire to do. We all have that impulse to see something, you know. It's the weekend, I got to get out of my apartment, I don't have to work, let me see some things, you know, that is outside of my reach. And so when we do this, we make certain selections and we realize who we are through that experience, through our own attraction for things. And that's one level, this magnetic attraction for an object or a material. And then there's this other experience is conceptualizing. And that means that you are not only thinking about the material and how much you like it or how beautiful it is, what it means intellectually, the context in which it is being displayed, where you went to browse for it, but also this idea that these things can be transformed when it's taken into a new context, which is your sculpture. And so when it enters your sculpture, you as the artist can have this acrobatic kind of experience where you change what it means. And that is the amazing thing that the human mind can do. It has the capacity to accept meaning on multiple levels simultaneously. And so we do not need to segregate. We do not need to categorize. We do not have to worry about this idea of confusion that we were very much in kind of mesmerized by in the 80s and 90s. I'm thinking of my faculty at Yale. I'm thinking about art critics, galleries, about what they would show, who they would show. Oh, this gallery, they like only work that looks like this. You should go to this gallery because your work looks like this. Oh, if you use too many things or trespass categories on disciplines, it will create confusion. Oh, the world cannot mix. Globalization is going to create all kinds of chaos. So we had this idea that nature itself was not natural. And you can bet all of this is happening in nature and that we are part of nature and everything is mixing all the time. And it's also these choices that we make in this mix that creates a kind of order that is customized for ourselves. When I look at my home, what's on the wall, what I choose, I'm choosing these things because I feel I want to identify with it. Not that I do identify with it, but you are shopping in that sense. You're shopping for who you are, what you want to be now versus 5 years from now. And it's a continuous process and it's a natural process. And that was very important for me to create this level of confusion, if you may, in the work, to create more vocabulary that then the audience and myself would become comfortable with, that it would be the new language.
The sentiment of choosing who you want to be and kind of thinking ahead, I think, is very important to both Ingrid and I as graduating seniors trying to figure out what our next life steps are. it also makes me think of the titles that you give your pieces. I am a notoriously bad decision maker and a notoriously bad namer of things, mostly because I can never feel like I can choose. And I love your titles because they're almost poems. I'd love to hear more about how you name your pieces, what you do.
So I think that when I started, it was very hard to convey the meaning of my work because of the aesthetic that I chose, which was very maximum rather than minimal. And that created for people confusion. And it was also my ethnicity, my gender, creates confusion. It's not the dominant voice in our visual language in the fine arts. And so I felt the need to voice more. And I could do that with text in a way that is not possible in the visual, in the concrete visual. And it is mostly because people really believe, have faith that the text is the text. You know, we have a kind of, there's a kind of frozen quality about the text that we think this word will mean the same thing in the future as it will in the past. So we have this kind of stability we think we have with the text that we don't have with visual language. And so I wanted to really add to this kind of visual language and aesthetic, an entry point for the audience, that they could look at the title and read it and know that they were reading it in a way that I can't read what this means, this painting means. I'm not sure what it means. But you can read a title and say, I can read this title. It says this. And then you have to ask, what does it mean? And we essentially are doing that with paintings, but we don't realize it, you know? So asking yourself what it means creates so much more responsibility for the viewer, but also adventure. You as the audience are making choices in what this means, and you are making those choices in the context of your own experience. And it allows so much more authority and fun for the viewer. And it allows me to also communicate both directly and in ways that are more metaphorical, symbolic. So all these things, all these different ways of communicating in text allows you to share more, you know, and to talk about subject matter that hadn't already been formed. In some sense, as an artist, what you strive to do is bring to the foreground things you don't understand yet. And in the future, we'll understand better. And so we can all kind of grow together in that way. So I thought that was really important to my work so that it wouldn't be misunderstood as something that is pretty, exotic, colorful, beautiful, Indian, American, all these things that are prescribed as a legitimate and transparent way of understanding the work. So this title kind of throws into the mix something a little more concrete, but also a little bit of a rope to pull you in.
Yeah, I love that you're thinking about the encounter that people will have with your work and how to manipulate that encounter, sort of not just with the work itself, but also with the title. I think that's really, it's really interesting. Switching gears a little bit, I'm really interested in how, so we've talked a lot about how identity and difference across cultures is something that you're really interested in subverting. And I'm wondering what it's like to make art in New York specifically, because you've lived in so many places all over the world, and to some extent America, but I think like in a heightened way, New York City is sort of meant to represents for a lot of people a place of cultural fusion and intersection. And so I'm curious as to how sort of like where you live and where you are has maybe impacted your practice, or what you think of New York as a city.
I think the amazing thing about travel is that when you go to another place, you feel different. Not only is the place different, but it's made you see yourself differently. And I think it can easily become a welcoming situation where you love that concept of finding a new self, and the exploration of self in light of being in another place is a way for you to understand the larger world that you haven't seen, you know, and to also bring context and real honesty to the way you look at the place you grew up and your own personal history, you know, and what does it mean to be in New York or a New Yorker or American? And how does the world see Americans? I was listening to the radio this morning, and they were talking about how Europe sees the US as a not very democratic place, less so and least so in the world among its neighbors who are democratic, is considered the least democratic. Now, I know most Americans are going to be like, wow, that's not really true, you know? So we have a kind of resistance to perspectives that are especially in contradiction to our own idea of self. And I think this is where we really expose our naivete about what that means, that vulnerability that we seek can be so important to addressing what you want for the future for the United States. And this kind of comparison we make between countries during COVID times, which countries are doing the vaccine properly, which ones have the most amount of failures in the health system, or who's been really good about lockdown, who's had good attitude towards lockdown. All these things really are like, I always think of it as siblings. Your siblings always know your worst failures, and they whisper your what's good about you in this idea of sibling rivalry, which we have between countries, you know? We're neighbors, we share in ambitions for the human family, and we share in this idea of needing leadership, whether we call it, you know, this kind of government or that kind. We want leadership and we want organization, and we want to be ready when we're in trouble to work together. And that is the bottom line that we've achieved, that we've made a commitment among people voicing their concerns outside of their government, saying the same thing. We want a better future for our home, our family, our health, and we want better leadership. And I think that allows us to really come together as a family in the whole earth, finally, because we're looking at the statistics. I've never in my whole entire life have seen in the news ideas about how country X is doing really well compared to us. We've never been that self-critical. It's always been we're number one, as the kind of cheering that we do, as if we're playing a magnificent sports game. And we're not. This is real life, and it's not a game. And we have great remorse when people are dying in India, when people are suffering in China, when we can't travel to these countries and we can't have our fun and we can't see a family member that's far away. That's what we share that brings us together, you know, our ambition for human beings. And I think that became very relevant to understanding comparisons.
Yeah, your retrospective at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts is called "Make Me a Summary of the World," which I think is like such an inspiring and really interesting title, and I think connects to this idea of like what makes us all human, like what makes us all a part of the world. I'd be curious to know how you see your, both the title of that retrospective, but also your work at large kind of intersecting with the goal of helping us to come to terms with our differences in order to perhaps see more similarities.
Very true. I think the title came from one of the sculptures that were included in the retrospective, and the summary that we're talking about is a summary that is impossible, because obviously the world is always changing, and there's so many things in the world that we would almost talk about it in terms of if a number, an infinite number of things in the world. And I think there's a lot of hopefulness invested in that idea that there's an infinite number of things in the world, that we make room for the infinite in this world, that anything can be possible, that anything can be left out that we need to include. So this work, this uphill work of summarizing the world is about our own generosity to the world. You know, that there is so much there that it's absurd to summarize, which is what history tries to do. That is what every representation and identification attempts to title, categorize, differentiate in order to make possible a transparency that cannot exist. And so that reach, you know, that reach for summarizing is very much representation of the Western colonial enterprise and expansionism. That once you conquer a place, you can control it, decide what is that part and parcel of representation of a country, and then you can stop it. That it cannot be more than that. Oh, no, that isn't Indian. No, that's not American. And that's ends. But we're learning at this very moment that so much can be American identity, that it is unsummarizable. If there is such a word, I don't know. And that is an important concept of the American dream, that you cannot exclude anyone, that anyone can be American. And so there is this kind of ambition that I always associate with being American, that is an ambition better and more important than authenticity, which has been a trophy of the colonial history that we have originated from.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for that. Do you think we have time for one more question, or maybe two more, Emma?
Yeah.
Because I think it could be nice to end with asking Rina maybe what inspires her right now. But I don't want to get there prematurely if we have time for a couple more.
Sure. It's almost a strange time where it's hard to think of the future.
Yeah.
And know what it will be. And so it is a strange time, an unfamiliar place that we are in, where things are changing fast in some ways, but they're really not changing at all. And so I think this idea of the future is really like making the work that will allow the future to be something new And something that is new is sadly so many things we've resisted in the past that so many communities have been talking about and have been voicing, but has never come to be in the mainstream. We have a desire to really open up places of unrest to a kind of organization that will allow us to both see it, understand it, participate with it, and not resist it. I think for me, being in New York City, I'm so much aware of the homelessness. Now that we are so often relegated during the pandemic to go home and stay home, there is so many situations, not just homelessness where your home is on the street, but a kind of lack of comfort that is in your home, that you depended on the infrastructure out there in the world to kind of plug your boat from sinking, you know? And now that infrastructure has been closed down, I think, wow, I mean, this is really hard. We have very small apartments in New York City. We don't have a backyard. We're very lucky that we can be pedestrians, where we can go out and see people, and I can see elderly people, and I can see people my age and young people and babies, and I can see people I've never met or know, but they live in my neighborhood because of pedestrian culture. What would happen if I was in a situation or the place of home rested on so much distance from the next human being, or the place of home was on the street, or the place of home was not comfortable, you know, that I didn't have heat. And so I depended on going to the library for not only my air conditioning, and this has happened to me, but also for my heat. And now I can't go. You know, when you think about how people have worked to survive through this infrastructure, I think we need more communal spaces that are available when we are going through lockdown, and that we need a kind of emergency kind of familiarity with what we should do when these things happen, that we're isolated from each other, which is the very cause of a lot of tension between the states in the United States, our isolation from each other. And then last, I really think when I contemplate the future is transportation that is shared and not just individual responsibility. And I think food, water, and shelter. We don't have these things for everyone, even in a place like this. And that is a huge failure we've experienced, even in the age of, in a time where we think we're so progressive because we have the iPhone 12, you know? So that makes me extremely sad to think that we have this technology that has helped us, but we still don't have basics.
Yeah.
So sorry. And that's also a form of distance too between the person who has that and the person who doesn't, and maybe not always being aware of the sort of like common humanity between those two groups of people.
Yeah. Distance, and the reason why this distance is so important to manage is that there's a lot of shame in discussing what you don't have in our culture. And so I know in talking to my daughter, who is a student at Yale right now, when the students had to go home, there was a sudden realization that some of these students, undergraduate students, were actually homeless.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't know where to put them, because we don't acknowledge that this is a very large problem. And I think the shame around it has caused us to silence ourselves, which allows more distance between those who know about it and those who pretend it doesn't exist, in order to make it comfortable for those who have all those things. And that's what I think with both Black Lives Matter and with gender discrimination, we're beginning to understand that we have to make a kind of psychological home for everyone to be visible.
Yeah, and I think like that's beautiful, and it like your work feels like it's trying to do that. I think especially in like to bring it back to sweaty concepts, but like I think that's also such a point of the exhibition. Like, what does it mean to try to make a space for everyone? How hard is it to find us in a space when the world is sometimes not built for us? And I think that your art and art in general, and communal art making is something that I'm really interested in, but has a place to help craft that space for everyone.
I hope so.
Well, thank you so much. This
Thank
is
you.
an absolute pleasure.
It was a delight for me to share with you, both Emma and Ingrid. It was wonderful to see your questions and to be able to share my answers with you and the audience. Thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so great conversing with you today. And as a side note, I love your